Tonight, we are celebrating the debut of a magnificent exhibition, Tiffany Glass Painting in Color and Light, which comes to us from the Neustadt collection of Tiffany Glass in Queens, New York. I hope that you've already had a chance to see it. If not, make a point to come back and really revel in these magnificent works of art. It is a thrill to bring so many of them, in fact, to the Cincinnati Art Museum. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you my colleague, Lindsy Parrott. Lindsy is the director and curator of the Neustadt collection in Queens, and the curator who organized the exhibition upstairs. Lindsy and I met about 11 years ago when she came to the museum to speak about Tiffany ceramics for an American Ceramic Circle meeting. And she is a very generous scholar and a revered authority when it comes to all things Louis Comfort Tiffany. So I can promise you, you are in for a treat this evening. She has spent the last 13 years centering her research on Tiffany glass, the leaded glass windows, lamps, and opalescent flat glass, how they were made, who made them, and why they're such enduring works of art. She has curated many exhibitions and published and spoken widely on Louis Tiffany and his achievements. Her forthcoming exhibition will open at the Corning Museum of Glass very soon. It is a show that she is co-curating with the curators at Corning on Tiffany's glass mosaics, and will be accompanied by a new catalog with wonderful groundbreaking research. Prior to the Neustadt, Lindsy held positions at the Charles Homer Morse Museum in Florida, where she caught the Tiffany bug, and at the Norton Museum of Art, also in Florida. We are so fortunate to have her with us tonight to talk about Tiffany glass. Please help me welcome Lindsy Parrott.
Good evening. It's lovely to see so many people here on a Thursday night. Thank you for spending your evening with us tonight. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Amy. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. Thank you to Emily and Russell for organizing this evening and for your hospitality too. I have to say I'm absolutely thrilled with the way the exhibition looks in the galleries upstairs. I think there are a lot of delightful surprises as you wend your way through the 3 galleries. So I hope you have had an opportunity to visit. If not, as Amy said, do come back over the weekend or tomorrow and delight in some of these objects. The Cincinnati Art Museum is, I must say, one of my most favorite museums, and I'm not just saying that because I'm standing here addressing a very passionate, committed group of people. I really love the emphasis on decorative arts. I'm a decorative arts historian. I'm an American art pottery lover, sort of first and foremost. And I love the way that the Cincinnati Art Museum really prioritizes telling stories about the materials and the medium and the way these works of art were made in your wonderful collection. And it's the lens through which we interpret our collection at the Neustadt. So it's delightful to be among colleagues who have a similar outlook and appreciation for the stories behind the finished objects. So we'll be talking about that a little bit tonight. I wanted to just give you a little bit of a roadmap for what we'll be talking about this evening. I'll give you a brief overview of Louis Comfort Tiffany so you have a sense of the scope of his career. But before I even do that, I wanted to briefly introduce you to the Neustadt collection so you can understand who we are. We're a small organization. We're not so well known, although that's beginning to change. But I want you to understand the importance of the objects that you'll see upstairs. So we'll do a brief intro to the Neustadt collection, a brief look at Louis Comfort Tiffany. We're going to talk a lot about the glass, and at the end there's a quiz. So it's incentive for staying awake in this warm, dark room. It's a friendly quiz, though, I assure you. Oh, no. Hang on. Why are we at the... Oh, I think we're at the end, because we're at the end. Hang on. Here we go. The hazard of having a duplicate slide at the front and the back. Okay, let's get going. So this is an image. I wanted to introduce you to Egon and Hildegard Neustadt, our founders. And this is the very first Tiffany lamp that they ever acquired. They were Austrian immigrants. They met in New York City. Dr. Neustadt was an orthodontist. Hildegard was his dental assistant and receptionist. He apparently hired her, fell in love. They got married in 1935, and they were living in Flushing, Queens, and trying to furnish their first apartment. They didn't have a lot of money, as many newlyweds don't, and so they were visiting a number of secondhand shops in Greenwich Village looking for a dining room table, Dr. Neustadt records. And while he was measuring dining room tables, Hildegard was poking around and spied what Dr. Neustadt describes in his memoirs as a strange old-fashioned lamp, which is sort of funny because they were being made still even just 10 years prior. So it wasn't that old-fashioned, but it gives you a sense of just how out of style these lamps were in 1935. And so they didn't have enough money for both the table and the lamp that day. But apparently Hildegard couldn't get this shade out of her mind. And so they went back a couple weeks later, talked to the shopkeeper, and asked, who made this wonderful lamp? And he said it was an American artist named Tiffany. And Dr. Neustadt writes they didn't know who Tiffany was, but recognizing the extreme beauty of this shade and being such lovers of their new adopted country, hearing that it was made by an American artist sealed the deal for them, and they did purchase the lamp that day. It was marked at $15. Apparently, Dr. Neustadt was quite the haggler and throughout his life, and he negotiated down to $12.50, and so the lamp went home with them. And this is the lamp that really kicked off their collection. Over the next 50 years, they would amass more than 200 Tiffany lamps, as well as assorted windows and a few other things that I'll show you now. But this is the lamp that did it. So one of the really remarkable things about Dr. Neustadt's collection, and I will keep referring to it as Dr. Neustadt's collection because Hildegard died in 1961. Dr. Neustadt lived until 1984, and he continued to collect very passionately following her death. So he's really credited with building the collection, but indeed it was Hildegard who spotted that first lamp. One of the marvelous things about the collection is that it includes a lot of really iconic examples, like this dragonfly that you see on the screen here that's in the gallery upstairs. But he also was collecting things that were one of a kind or very, very rare, special commissions that were made in limited quantities, like this pond lily globe that you see on the right. This is one of two. The other is in the collection of the Charles Hosmer Morse Museum of American Art that Amy mentioned in Florida. And we believe that these were Newell Post lamps. And can you imagine how grand they would have been at perhaps the top and bottom of the stairs? So iconic works and one of a kind or very rare works. He was also collecting lamps of every form. So we have table lamps, we have floor lamps, we have hanging shades. A couple of these you'll see upstairs. And one of the things that was so remarkable about his collection was that he was collecting in multiples. So rather than collecting kind of a greatest hits or the most iconic lamps, he was collecting some pretty humble examples, as well as collecting pretty broadly and deeply. So we have a number of lamps in the collection that we have more than one example, like these two peonies that I'm showing you here. So we have two peonies, 5 laburnum shades, 3 peony hanging shades, and it's this really unprecedented opportunity to begin to compare these objects and to talk about connoisseurship and to talk about good, better, best. What makes a superb Tiffany lamp? And so this was a really novel idea that Dr. Neustadt was very pioneering in this regard, collecting in multiples. He also collected windows, and these two windows are upstairs in the gallery. The one on the right is attributed to Agnes Northrop, the woman who was a very famous designer and is credited with designing all of Tiffany's landscape windows. The window on the right is by Frederick Wilson, the designer who was the head of the ecclesiastical department. And a couple of the windows in the Cincinnati Art Museum's collection were also designed by Frederick Wilson. So you may really recognize the faces. He has this very distinctive kind of pre-Raphaelite indebted style. And so here's Dr. Neustadt. I'm delighted to tell you he did not live like this. He had He was eccentric, but perhaps not that eccentric. And he had a townhouse on East 62nd Street on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and he had converted a few of the rooms into kind of an apartment museum, as he called it. And so here he would showcase his lamps, and you see a number of favorite ones. And I should point out, in the foreground here, he had purchased this magnificent rookwood base that he paired with the Tiffany lampshade, and it's one of the centerpieces, one of the grand examples in our collection. I'm sorry that it's not here in Cincinnati, but we're very proud to have it. In 1970, he published a book really documenting his collection, and it remains a pivotal text today. And today you can find our collection in a gallery devoted to the Neustadt's collection at the Queens Museum in Flushing Meadow, Corona Park. And then you, of course, know that we have traveling exhibitions because here we are. And I wanted to mention this one last very exciting part of Dr. Neustadt's collection. In 1967, he purchased over 250,000 pieces of glass that were left over from the Tiffany studios when it closed in 1937. And so this is really the lens through which we interpret our collection. And I must say, every time I'm looking at a Tiffany object, I'm looking mostly at the glass, sort of first and foremost at the glass, because the glass is really the key to the artistry and beauty of Tiffany's windows. So we'll be talking about that this evening. You can see him here admiring a full sheet of Tiffany's spotted glass. But look what a terrible jumble it was when it arrived. Some of the glass was packed in boxes with rocks for reasons that we can't figure out. Presumably we had some larger sheets, but the rocks made sure that we had many more pieces. So this is just a snapshot of some of the glass that we have in our glass archive, and you can see that we're cataloging it, we're storing it upright so that it's safe. You get a sense of a few of the uncut sheets of Tiffany glass. They're about this big. So it's a really special, marvelous collection, the only collection like it in the world. It also includes some wonderful little pieces of iridescent glass that were used for mosaics and some pressed glass jewels, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And finally, this is a sneak preview of some of the different types of glass that we'll be talking about. And a few of these examples are on view upstairs. But let's take a brief look at Louis Comfort Tiffany. I thought you might enjoy seeing some photographs of him as a young man. Frequently we see photos of him as, at sort of the ripe old age of 68, and he's, very distinguished all the way on the right. This is a portrait that you see frequently of him, but he was kind of a handsome, self-assured artist. And he, of course, was the son of Charles Louis Tiffany, who was the founder of Tiffany & Company, the well-known jewelry and silver retail emporium. And you see Charles Louis Tiffany on the left in the top hat. He's a similarly distinguished man. And Tiffany & Company began as a retail outlet, but they weren't just retailing any old thing. They were retailing the finest decorative arts and sculpture from around the world. They had agents who would travel all over the world, sourcing some of the most important, most finely crafted and designed objects. And so it was really a formative experience for young Louis to be exposed to these extraordinary objects. And it's presumably where he really honed his eye and his love of fine craftsmanship and color. You get a sense of the glass and ceramic showroom, how it's bursting with these wonderful objects that would have so inspired him. Now, Louis began his artistic career as a painter, and he was part of a newly kind of emerging field of watercolor. He was also painting in oil on canvas, but watercolor was one of his favorite mediums as well. And you can see here that the types of paintings that he was creating, they were not so much impressionistic, but atmospheric. You get a sense that although these are very different scenes, his interest in color and light remained the same regardless of what he was painting. And I particularly love the reflection on the water here. It reminds me of some of the effects that we see later on in his glass career. So this interest in color and light developed early. It was part of his painting career, but presumably he was ultimately frustrated with being able to capture color in its purest form and being able to really capture and emulate bursts of sunlight. And so he was in search of a medium that would allow him to create these atmospheric scenes and capture color and light in a more true way. He began as a painter and very quickly branched out into interior decoration, and he was working for some of the wealthiest people in America. For instance, George Kemp, who was a pharmaceutical magnate. You see here his Moorish parlor that Tiffany decorated in 1879. And he was paying attention to every possible detail within those interiors. So the wall treatments, the ceiling treatments, the design of the furniture, the glass tiles that were cladding the surround of the fireplace, the hanging fixtures, and here, of course, is one of his earliest windows made in glass. Now, pay attention to this color palette. It's pretty sedate, wouldn't you agree? The sort of deep purples, orange, kind of deep green. I mean, it's a lovely window, but it's not wildly colorful in the way that you might expect for Tiffany. And that's because there just wasn't very much artistic glass available around 1880. That would soon change. Tiffany pressed on with his interior decoration, securing more high-profile commissions. He decorated the Lyceum Theater, which was the first electrified theater in the United States, and is purported to have worked with Thomas Edison on this commission. He also decorated the White House, a number of rooms under President Chester A. Arthur, and he created this grand leaded screen. The images that I'm showing you, the two black and white photographs are period photographs. The two color images are more recent reproductions to give us a sense of what the color schemes of those rooms would have looked like. So he decorated the red room, the blue room, and this, what was then called the Traverse Hall. Sadly, none of this exists. The story goes that when Teddy Roosevelt moved in, he removed all of this kind of frippery and decked the place out with a lot of taxidermy. Quite a different aesthetic. It's very sad. I think it's very sad. Tiffany had a reputation that was rapidly growing, and he really was sort of announced on an international stage for the very first time at the World's Columbian Exposition, which was held in Chicago in 1893. And so I'm showing you here a couple of views of some of the wonderful things that he was exhibiting. This is a fabulous chapel that was installed at the Morse Museum in Florida in the late 90s. You can see that it is just kind of a wonderful study in color. It's richly encrusted with glass mosaics. And look at this lighting fixture. I mean, it's just this phenomenal three-dimensional cruciform, and it really is a celebration of light with all of those bare light bulbs. So in very short order, he won huge acclaim at this fair. He won 54 awards, more than anyone else exhibiting at the fair, and his reputation, as you can imagine, was set. Now, I keep talking about Louis, but I want to pause for a moment and make sure that everyone here understands that Louis was the artistic director of the Tiffany Studios. He was the kind of design conscience of the studio, but he was employing a huge number of very talented men and women at the studios. And at his height of business, he was employing about 700 different people, and they held all manner of jobs, lots and lots of craftspeople, of course. But there were also people who were very adept at business and marketing, and so it was really quite the production. And you get a sense of some of the people that he's employing here in these studio shots. So I want to make sure that although I keep talking about Tiffany because he's the man behind the aesthetic and the artistic legacy, he was working with a number of very talented people, and he recognized and appreciated their talents. Now, of course, Louis was producing things, or his firm was producing things in a huge variety of media. He's best known for glass, but he was working in ceramics. He was designing jewelry that was retailed at Tiffany & Company. He was doing a lot of work in metals. I'm showing you here on the top left a fabulous example that you may be acquainted with here at the Cincinnati Art Museum's collection. What a stupendous collection of early blown glass you have here. It's really mind-blowing. I'd never seen it before, so it's been thrilling. But then, in addition to these works, of course, he is producing all sorts of flat glass to create his leaded glass windows and lamps. Now, I want to pause for a moment, and I hope as you're looking at these, you're thinking, she's lost her mind. Those aren't Tiffany. I hope you can already tell that. So here we are at TGI Fridays or Ruby Tuesdays or something like that. But I just wanted to pause for a moment before we get into Tiffany's leaded glass, just to acknowledge how ubiquitous the Tiffany lamp form is today. You know, people see lamps like this and they say, oh, that's a Tiffany lamp, and it most assuredly is not a Tiffany lamp. But I think we really take this form for granted, and sometimes it's easy to breeze by a Tiffany lamp in a museum because you're so well acquainted with this leaded glass form. And so tonight we're going to talk about what makes Tiffany's lamps in particular special, and it really does all boil down to the glass. The designs are very, very important, but really the key to the beauty lies in the glass, and I hope you can see this here. Keep these in your mind's eye. I also want to just pause for a moment and show you a couple of Tiffany-inspired windows. So these are windows that are made of opalescent glass, this very colorful glass that Tiffany was famous for. But there's something about these that's just a little off. The glass is perfectly fine, it's colorful, you would, I hope, agree. But there's something about the selection that just isn't terribly inspired, in my opinion. So this is a preview of the quiz that will come at the end. All right, so let's talk about Louis and his glass. As a young man, Louis Comfort Tiffany was privileged enough to go on a grand tour and travel all over Europe. And while he was in France, he was really struck by the beauty of medieval glass windows. And while I don't want to suggest that these are the two windows that inspired him, they're the type of windows that he would have been seeing at these famous cathedrals. And so look at the gorgeous colors here. They're not terribly wildly colored, but the blues are deep, cool, saturated. The reds are really brilliant. Look at the wonderful yellows. And there's a minimum of paint in these windows. The paint has just been employed to really render facial expressions. And so Tiffany was so deeply inspired by these brilliant colors, the way that the light was pouring through the windows and splashing colors on the stone. And so he, as well as a few colleagues, set out to revive this wonderful colored glass of the medieval period. He was interviewed in 1917, and the interviewer asked him, why not be satisfied with painting on glass? And Tiffany replied, too formal, too cold, I declared. Glass covered with brushwork produces an effect both dull and artificial. I could not make an inspiring window with paint. I had to use a medium that appealed to me. And so this detail that I'm showing you on the bottom of the screen, this is not a Tiffany window, and I in fact don't remember where I took this photograph, but you can see that while it's beautifully executed, it's very muted. You don't get a sense that light is pouring through it, and I think it does really illustrate how paint really tamped down the passage of light. And so this is something that Tiffany was rebelling against. In the 18th and 19th centuries, stained glass had, in Tiffany's opinion, reached quite a low point. And now I think that that's perhaps a grand overstatement. There's some very nice painted stained glass out there, glass that I'm passionate about also. But this is the kind of window that Tiffany would have been acquainted with, and this is the kind of window people thought of when they thought of stained glass in the 18th and 19th centuries. So you can see that there are panels of colorless glass that have been leaded together in a very rigid grid, and then the stained glass artist has basically used those pieces of glass as a painter would paint on a canvas. So it's a picture that has been applied to colorless glass. It's beautifully executed, but light doesn't really pour through it. It's not, this is a word we use internally all the time, it's not very zhuzhy. But it's well executed, and I don't mean to pick on this particular artist. Now, one of the reasons that people were really painting on the surface of glass is because colored glass wasn't readily available. I'm showing you here glass from our collection, and on the left, the glass is, you can see it in reflected light, and on the right, the glass is in transmitted light. So light is pouring through the glass on the right. But look how similar the coloration is. There's not a lot of zip and pizzazz as it's illuminated. And so Tiffany and some of his colleagues were very frustrated by the lack of artistic material, and they set out to change that. I want to just briefly give credit where credit is due. This fellow, John Lafarge, was also a painter and a decorator like Tiffany. He was one of Tiffany's contemporaries. And he's really credited with the idea of using this colorful opalescent glass and applying it to windows. Tiffany saw what Lafarge was doing very early on, was deeply inspired by these paintings in glass, and set out on his own track to make something similar and to execute his vision in glass. But it's important to give John Lafarge the credit that he's due. Tiffany did not originate this idea, but he certainly took it off in bold new directions. And so what is opalescent glass? You've heard me use this word a couple of times now, and it's tricky to define. Opalescent glass was not a new type of glass. It was a glass that was widely available. It was used for pressed glass table objects like the sugar bowl you see here. This is a piece that I bought for our collection. This is not a piece Tiffany had seen, but again, it's an opalescent piece of glass. And look at the way the color changes as the light rakes across it. You can see that it fires up with this wonderful kind of amber glow, and it really amplifies the light and amplifies colors that were mixed with it. And so these coloristic properties were something that Tiffany was interested in, and he and Lafarge and a handful of colleagues set out to work with glassmakers to roll this type of glass into flat sheets that could then be cut and used in leaded glass windows. And now Louis, while he was employing a lot of chemists, very early on he was doing his own glass experiments. And so one of his early collaborators, Candace Wheeler, who you may be familiar with, she was a decorator and very famous for her textile designs. She describes that at the top of his 4th Avenue studios in Manhattan were the glass rooms where Mr. Tiffany's experiments in color went on, and where he was working out his problems from bits of old iridescent Roman vases that had lain centuries underground. Or he was finding out the secrets of tints in ancient cathedral windows and the proportions of metals and chemicals which would produce certain shades of color. The actual melting and mixing was done in a laboratory underneath his apartments far up on 5th Avenue, but the results of study and effect of juxtaposition were tried in the glass loft. Apparently there was an explosion, and so he stopped mixing glass on his own and left it to the professionals. But early on, he did have a very hands-on approach to figuring out how to make wonderfully colored glass. So I'm going to show you a brief video on how opalescent sheet glass is made, and I think it will be very revealing so that you can understand these swirls and rivulets of color. This is the Kokomo Opalescent Glass Company. It's pretty humble digs, as I think you can see. This is a glass company that was founded in 1888. Tiffany bought huge quantities of opalescent glass from Kokomo because he hadn't yet opened his own glass furnaces. And they're still in operation. You can go and tour. I encourage you to do so. Amy has visited as well, and it's a riveting experience. But you can live vicariously through this video clip. So the sand and all of the metallic oxides that are the colorants are mixed into these great wheelbarrows. They are shoveled into this furnace, and the furnace is burning at about 2,300 degrees, and it takes about 24 hours for all of this stuff to melt down into this kind of molten lava consistency, and here you can see it in the pot. And then the magic begins. This is a very carefully choreographed ballet. You will see here glass workers taking these gigantic ladles. Some of them hold up to 40 pounds of glass, and they are ladling out this molten glass. You can't tell which color it is. It's all this fiery orange, and they're casting it down on the rolling table. And the video is very self-explanatory. There's no sound. So here they're ladling it out of the furnace, and this is the base glass. This is the largest ladle. And it is hot and it is heavy. Look at the way he's running. And the glass is spilling out. You have to wear special shoes. And then here's a little accent color. We're not sure what it is. And the table man comes over with this long fork, heaves it, stabs it a couple of times, mixes it. It's sort of this taffy-like consistency. It's rapidly cooling. He gives it another couple of turns and then slings it through these rollers. And here you can see it pouring out on the other side in this flat sheet. This process is identical to the process 100 plus years ago. The only difference now, I'm sure the protective gear is better, but the rollers are mechanized now. Previously, they were rolling it by hand. So it's a fascinating process. And the resulting sheet might look something like this. This is an uncut sheet from our collection. Now, as I said, Tiffany's reputation was on the rise, and so many churches in particular were beginning to commission huge windows to adorn their newly built sanctuaries, which require decoration. And that was certainly the case here in Cincinnati. There are a number of wonderful Tiffany windows that are still extant. And so here's a gigantic window. It was made by the Tiffany Glass Company in 1887. It's in Milwaukee. It was 20 by 30 feet. It was the largest window, opalescent window, that had ever been created. And it required, as you can imagine, a lot of glass. And Tiffany was having a difficult time starting to be able to source not only the quantities of glass that he required, but also the different types of glass so that he could achieve these kind of painterly effects in glass. So in 1888, Tiffany had seen a tremendous increase in his business, and he reported in a newspaper article that his firm had made more windows in 6 months than they had in the preceding 2 years. So sourcing this glass was turning into a dire experience, and his reputation depended on having beautiful materials. He had been buying glass from a number of different glass makers, and I love this quote. This is by one of the fellows that he was purchasing glass from, John Dannenhofer, and he said in a newspaper article, "One curious thing about the manufacture of colored glass is the uncertainty of results. As one might say in a whisper, there are only 2 things more uncertain, the mood of a woman and the heels of a mule. We, for instance, never know exactly how the shade of color will be in the finished product." And this is so, I mean, it's a great quote, but this is so revealing because this is 1905. People had been making opalescent glass since about 1880, and they still were being surprised by the results coming out of the furnaces. So this was presumably driving Tiffany crazy. He didn't have this dependable source of artistic material. So he decided to take things into his own hands, and he could because he had this vast fortune, the Tiffany fortune, behind him. And so he opened his own glass furnaces in Corona, Queens, which was quite unpopulated at the time, and he opened the furnaces in 1893. Hired chemists, talked to them about the effects that he was looking for, and the experimentation began. And our lives are richer for it. This is another wonderful quote, and I think it's very revealing about the process. There are 2 great secrets in the makeup of opalescent windows. One is the art of making the glass itself, which we've just talked about. The other, that of selecting glass to express something, to tell a story or convey a thought. So that's what we're going to talk about now. The way that this glass was selected to give the suggestion of dappled sunlight or pools of color. I wanted to share this photo with you. The image on the top it's a selection of glass from our archive, but I wanted to include it to give you a sense of just how many greens there might be available to Tiffany's glass selectors. I mean, look at all of these different shades of green, to say nothing of the variety of textures. An article from the Washington Post described that the artistic vision began to take material form when, quote, "the artist descends into the cellar of the Tiffany studios, where an immense amount of glass of all hues and textures is stored in classified presses, just as books are stored in a library, but according to colors instead of titles to select his glass." And I think you really get a sense of that with the way that we store the glass. It's very much the way that Tiffany was storing it. All right, so let's talk about some of the types of glass that Tiffany was innovative in creating and innovative in using. And one of the most perhaps dramatic types of glass is drapery glass. And I think that you can see why it is so named. It's a very sculptural type of glass. In the 18th and 19th century, when people wanted to render drapery, on clothing, they would paint the folds. But Tiffany wanted it to be a more visceral experience. He wanted it to be more naturalistic. And so he worked with his glass makers to roll the glass into flat sheets and then to take wooden paddles and press the sides together so that the glass would buckle into these soft folds, sometimes dramatic folds. And so I'm showing you here a juxtapositioning of 2 different windows. And again, I'm sorry, I took this photo on the left at one point and I was silly and didn't jot down who the artist was. So I don't mean to not give credit it for this lovely window. But the window on the right is a Tiffany window in the Neustadt's collection. And I love this particular detail on this young woman's hip, this woman Lydia. Can you see how it looks as though she's taken her gown and kind of scrunched it up under a sash? And you get this wonderful effect of the glass kind of billowing over around her hips, and it's very naturalistic and wonderful. And so it's almost like a sort of a bas relief, kind of this low relief sculpture. Although it's a flat two-dimensional window, it has this wonderful depth to it. It's really astonishing. This is one of my favorite windows. It's at a church in Connecticut, and this was a window designed by a very famous American painter, Elihu Vedder. This is quite an early window, but look at the diversity of textures, drapery textures in this. I especially love the detail on the bottom where it looks like the wind has caught the edge of her gown and it's kind of whipping it around her ankles. But that wonderful swirl has been so carefully selected to suggest the movement of the wind. It's a really inspired, very sculptural window. And you have some great examples of drapery glass here at the Cincinnati Art Museum, and I apologize, I took these on my iPhone over the last couple of days, but you have the real McCoy here. You can go upstairs and see it for yourself, but look at this wonderful piece of drapery glass and the way it just softly falls across the angel's foot. You really do get a sense of the weight of the fabric and the gentle pleating that would have occurred in a gown like this. And so it's a wonderful example of the kind of movement that drapery glass can have. On occasion, drapery glass was used in lamps, but really only in the magnolia shades, which are quite large shades. But you can see how, in this detail, the drapery glass really does suggest that kind of thick, fleshy petal of the magnolia. One of the other types of textured glass that Tiffany was using, and apparently pioneered, is called feather glass. And this glass was made by rolling the sheet of glass flat and then taking the roller and jostling it back and forth while the glass was still molten to create this herringbone pattern. It was used extensively in feathers in all of these angel windows that they were producing. And so this is a single sheet in our collection, but I wanted you to see it in reflected and transmitted light. You can see how the color changes. You really get a sense of the movement as the roller is jostled back and forth. And you can see how it could be cut so beautifully to render all of these feathers in these complicated wings. So rather than cutting, sort of each and every feather that you might imagine in the wings, they were able to cut large swaths of glass to really suggest the texture and keep the design light and airy. These are great wings in the windows that you have in the collection. And this is a window that we have in the Neustadt's collection. I wanted to show it because I think the coloration is so beautiful. They've done something called plating, where they've layered brightly colored glass behind the white or sort of transparent glass to create this rainbow shaded effect. And so again, it's a lovely use of this feathered glass. Rippled glass was another type of texture. Tiffany seems to have both purchased rippled glass and also manufactured his own, and it was used for a huge variety of effects. Here I'm showing you a detail of sort of wind-ruffled leaves. It was, of course, used for water. That's a pretty literal use of it, but this is a lovely window where you get the water kind of rippling in the basin and pouring into the pool. And it was used sometimes in really clever and creative ways. Look at this fabulous detail of this dragon and St. George slaying the dragon. You get the sense of this kind of scaly, wonderful dragon skin. And I love that there was some kind of little happy accident that they've incorporated into this window. You see where the green eye is kind of shining through. It looks like something maybe happened there, but the selectors were so skilled that they recognized a great artistic opportunity to use that happy accident to great effect in this window. And sometimes the glass was used for a quiet background. This is a lamp in our collection. It's called Dragonfly in Water, and you get the sense that the dragonflies are hovering over the rippling water surface. And it's also used in a lampshade that's on view upstairs. This is called the conventional design, and there are these long pieces of rippled glass that have been used to suggest silken fringe at the bottom of a lampshade. Fringe was a very popular style of silk lampshade at the turn of the century, and I love that Tiffany has incorporated this or tried to suggest this in glass. Glass that is commonly called confetti glass seems to have been called by Tiffany foliage glass. And this was a wonderful type of glass that was made by first blowing a very thin bubble of glass on a blowpipe. And they would blow it so thin that the bubble of glass would shatter into all of these little bits of fract or confetti. And they would sprinkle this glass onto the rolling table, ladle molten glass on top of it, pass the roller over it, and all these little bits would be stuck into the surface. And you could change the colors of the bits, you could change the colors of the base glass, and so there are a huge variety of effects that were a result. I love this detail of a window where you get a sense that the stag is taking a little sip from the stream, but you're seeing it through the brush. And so it's this kind of quiet, stolen moment, and they've used this foliage glass to great effect to give a sense of the brush in front of the deer. Here's an overview of it. You can see, too, that the foliage glass has actually been used for the foliage in the trees. There's a profusion of foliage glass in one of my favorite windows in our collection, this reader window. It was based on this painting that I'm showing you on the left by Jules Joseph Lefebvre. We don't know the location of this image of this painting, so I can only show you this black and white. But you still can get a sense of the dense foliage that this young woman is standing in front of. And look how beautifully it's been translated with this very dimensional, very rich foliage glass that's surrounding her. The photo doesn't really do it justice. I would encourage you to take another look in the galleries. And to give you a sense of what the painting might have looked like, what the color palette was, and just how true Tiffany and his glass selectors were to the original, I show you another painting by Lefebvre where the young woman is wearing the exact same costume. This is another fantastic window, kind of a transom in a private home, something that was once a private home in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And you can see that the foliage glass has been used to kind of, not to any particular decorative effect, but to create kind of a muted look around these wonderful clusters of wisteria. On the top left, I'm showing you a period photo from a Tiffany publication and the window as it exists today in the historic house. Streaky glass was perhaps one of the areas where Tiffany's chemists excelled, and every imaginable color combination was possible and was made. Here you can see wonderful streaky pink used for blossoms. This is a fantastic hollyhock that's on view upstairs, and you can see that the white glass shades to this wonderful pink. Of course, the variety of reds that were available in streaky glass, and the streaks in this glass are very subtle. The coloration is very subtle, but it's been changed just enough to make this shade dynamic and visually interesting. There's this wonderful quote, "Part of the enjoyment of opalescent flat glass lies in the surprises awaiting one when the glass is held up to the light," something that we all know, right? A pane of dark blue and white, as you might see on the top left, harsh and crude in reflected light, becomes suddenly glorious when seen in transmitted light, like a sunset all at once illuminating the sky in this land of brilliant effects, the light playing richly as through clouds and haze with the varying densities and textures of the glass. And you can see that these windows in this glass really inspired poetry from these journalists at the turn of the century. So this is the same piece of glass seen in reflected light bouncing off of the surface of the glass on the left, and with light pouring through it on the right. And you can see how it changes and really lights up the room. And you get a similar effect in this window, our well-by fence that is included in the exhibition. It looks like a kind of a cloud-strewn sky on a maybe breezy summer morning or evening. Mottled, or what Tiffany seems to have called spotted glass, was used to great effect, but you see it most frequently in kind of this sun-dappled foliage. This is a window that you may well be familiar with. It's a very famous window in the Metropolitan Museum's collection. And look how wonderful even just this tiniest detail in the bottom right-hand corner is. It really looks like this autumn foliage. It's called autumn landscape, and it's due in large part to the beauty of this spotted glass. And here are some full sheets, so you can see the diversity of spots that were available to Tiffany's selectors. How to choose just the right passage for that dappled sunlight, that dappled foliage, must have been quite a task. And this glass is also used for more decorative effects. Here are 2 lamps that are upstairs. I want to point out that the lamp on the left is a real feat of glassmaking. These larger kind of panels decorating the central portion of the lampshade. If you do visit again, take a closer look at them. They're a combination of up to 5 colors. That was an unbelievable feat of chemistry, and it stands out as maybe one of Tiffany's greatest accomplishments, or his chemist's greatest accomplishments, combining all of these wonderful colors into a single sheet of glass. And finally, we'll take a look at glass jewels. These were, by and large, pressed into molds. They came in a multitude of colors and shapes and translucencies. You have some wonderful hand-chipped jewels making up the frames in your windows upstairs, and I show you just a small detail here. But you can see that they really add, I mean, forgive me, it's a little bit of fun, but like a jewel-like element to really frame these windows, and it's absolutely lovely. This kind of unexpected flash of color and texture. This is a favorite window at a college in Easton, Pennsylvania that we worked with in the last year, and this is Alcuin and Charlemagne. And look at the wonderful, rich jewels that are used in both of the men's costumes, both as kind of a cloak clasp and this wonderful kind of bejeweled neck ornament. And you can see that these really have a high profile. They're large chunks of jewels, as you can see on the right in this kind of profile image. And then this is a very special lamp that's in the exhibition upstairs. These are clear turquoise cabochons that really act as these wonderful pinpoints of light. And they break up this opalescent surface, which, and the glass opalescent glass is gorgeous, but it adds, these cabochons add this real kind of visual interest to the surface of this, making it a little bit more sculptural and making the design, I think, much more dynamic because of the play of light. And this is probably how that lamp was originally displayed, rather than hanging from 3 chains, probably snapped into a collar mounted flush to the ceiling. But there are some other pressed glass jewels here in this lamp. These were called turtleback tiles. And then a discovery that we've just made since we've been here. I'm here with a colleague, our curatorial and collections assistant. We visited Christchurch Cathedral, just not too far from here, and it turns out they had a glorious Tiffany interior once upon a time. It was redecorated, but they do retain a few elements, including 2 wonderful lighting fixtures that look like this, and they're comprised of these fantastic opalescent pressed glass jewels. So we were just positively bananas when we stumbled in there, and the archivist was there, and it just all came together. So it's been a really brilliant and exciting discovery in our own research. The last thing that I wanted to mention, we've been talking, of course, a lot about the glass, but I want to draw your attention, too, to the importance of lead lines in Tiffany's designs. You can see that the image on the left is a window who, again, I took this photo, I didn't jot down the designer, but I think that it was made by the Gorham Ecclesiastical Department out of Providence. And they're trying to do sort of a medieval style window where they have all of these lead lines cutting across the figure in a pretty disjointed way. And I show you for comparison a window in our collection where the lead lines are really the outlines of the figures and the scene. They really support the design. They don't intersect it in these kind of jarring and disjointed ways. So the lead lines really do become just kind of a lovely supporting element for the window, but they were very thoughtfully and purposefully incorporated into the designs. And so I'll end tonight with these 2 works. As I said, Tiffany was first a painter in watercolor and in oil, and I wanted to show you two paintings that he did, which were later translated into glass, so that you could judge for yourself how successful he was in painting with color and light. On the left, it's his watercolor of taming the flamingos or feeding the flamingos, and on the right, you see the translation into glass. This was a window that was exhibited at the Columbian Exposition in 1893, and people were just absolutely bowled over by. He exhibited both the watercolor and the window, and I suspect that the window received much more acclaim. I've read very little about the watercolor, which is lovely, but the window is where it's at. And then I wanted to show you this, and this is perhaps one of my personal favorites. This painting of peonies on the top left. To be fair, we don't know the location of this painting. If you own it, please let us know. But this is a photograph that was reproduced in Tiffany's biography in 1914. So we can't be absolutely sure how accurate the color is in this painting. So we'll cut Tiffany a little bit of slack. But look how absolutely glorious the glass translation of this painting is. And this photograph, while it's lovely, it just doesn't do it justice. This was sold at Christie's a handful of years ago for almost $1 million. It's a perfect little size. It would fit in all of our homes very easily. It was in a retirement community, and they sold it and received a pretty penny. It's in a private collection currently. But the profusion of peonies, I mean, look at all of this fabulous glass. You see spotted glass, you see foliage glass, you see streaky glass. There's even some textured glass in there. And so it's really this fantastic culmination of Tiffany's chemist glass-making prowess, but also his coloristic sense. So I wanted to end on this really stupendous, kind of a quiet but very rich window. And now for the quiz. Who's feeling bold? Okay, so now you are all experts on Tiffany glass, the types of glass that Tiffany was using, the ways in which he was using the glass. So I have 3 slides, and I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many of you think that the lamp on the left is authentic? Raise your hand. Okay. I would say maybe a quarter of you. Okay. I'm very sorry to say it's the lamp on the right. Now, this is a lamp that's upstairs, so you can go and see it for yourself. And I'll tell you why. I won't just tell you which is which is which. But so the lamp on the left, while it's perfectly lovely, it lacks sort of the coloristic pizzazz of Tiffany's glass. And that's a little difficult to see on the slides, admittedly. Take a look at the base even for a moment. I know we're talking about glass here, but the casting on the right, the design is a little more complex. The patina is a little richer. And in fact, as I look at this now, this has never occurred to me, but this base looks sort of tiny and like the lamp is a little tippy, right? The shade is very generous compared to the proportions of that base. But really, overall, there's just not a lot of diversity of color, and it's not nearly as inspired as the selection of the wisteria lamp on your right. Now, everyone should get this right because you've already seen this slide. And maybe I won't ask for a show of hands. I don't want to embarrass anyone who might have nodded off. It's late, I know. So I hope that you can see that it's the window on the right that is the Tiffany window. So in addition to having already seen it and knowing the answer to this particular question, can you see how the window on the left, it's nicely selected, it's made out of opalescent glass, but there's something about it that's quite flat. Would you agree? The window on the right, you get a sense of kind of a receding horizon. And it's sort of a shallow picture plane, but you do get a sense that you could sort of walk into this composition. To say nothing of how I personally think the glass is a lot more interesting. The glass, I think, the selection and the design on the left is pretty literal, but can you see that it's a little more impressionistic on the right? We had that wonderful foliage glass thicket in the front of the deer, and you have a pretty literal bush here on the left. Okay, so now this one is tricky. And you may already be familiar with this window. This is another window that's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. It was a postage stamp a number of years ago. So one of these is authentic, and one of them is a reproduction of this much beloved window. And I'll give you a moment to take a look, and then I'm going to ask for a show of hands again. This was a window, incidentally, that was made for a mausoleum. It was designed by Agnes Northrop, the designer that I mentioned earlier. Okay, now how many of you think it's the window on the right? Okay. And how many of you think it's the window on the left? Okay, the left is correct. And I'll tell you why. And this is much, much harder. So don't be beating yourself up. So the window on the right is beautifully selected. There's some gorgeous glass in this window. There's some very nice opalescent glass that's being made today. But take a look at the kinds of glass that are used in the composition on the right. It's a lot of spotted glass. So do you see that the clouds are made out of spotted glass? The yellow glass looks like it has some spots in it. The mountain range is spotted glass. Admittedly, they've changed the colors, but it's still spotted glass. The water is spotted glass. The green foliage is spotted. The irises are also spotted. It's there's a uniformity to the type of glass, even though they've changed the color, and the color selection is quite good. It's very true, wouldn't you say, to the window on the left, but it's just too much of the same type of glass. And it looks like the construction is quite nice too. But the window on the left, the authentic version, there are a number of different kinds of glass. There's drapery glass that's been used for the magnolias. And it looks like maybe there's a little bit of drapery glass that's been used, the one on the right. But there's streaky glass for the clouds in the skies. You get a sense of some different kinds of streaks and pools of color in the mountains. Here with the banks of irises, you have both a streaky glass, a rippled glass, and a spotted glass. And it's interesting because the spotted glass has been used in these blossoms in the far back. Right here. And they used spotted glass so that they wouldn't have to cut each of those individual petals. It's sort of an impressionistic look at the irises. We know that they're irises because we can see them in the foreground, but as they recede, you wouldn't see them in such extreme detail. And so the glass selectors have taken the liberty of just kind of suggesting the complexity of these blossoms with spotted glass. So it's important. Sometimes the color is really great, but pay even closer attention to the types of glass that are used. It shouldn't be so uniform. All right, so now you're all experts. Thank you for your attention. Enjoy. So I'm happy to take questions. If you would raise your hand, we have some microphones that will come around so that everyone can hear your question.
I saw yours go up right away.
Thank you.
Hi there.
The bases of the lamps on Antiques Roadshow, sometimes they turn them over and they say Tiffany as well. So who made those?
Tiffany had his own bronze foundry. It was opened in 1897. It was also located in Corona, Queens, just across the street from the glass factory. And for a time, it was the largest bronze foundry in the United States. So they worked with a lot of very famous artists to cast their sculptures because they had the facilities. There's, in fact, a 17-foot tall bronze sculpture at Gettysburg National Park that was cast by the Tiffany Studios. They didn't design it, but they were the foundry. Tiffany wanted to control all aspects of the production, so he was making the glass and casting the bronze.
Hi. In the last challenge that you gave us,
Yes.
the iris, the mountain valley, the water that was in the mountain valley on the true Tiffany, I can't imagine how they produced that valley of that little water there.
That's a very good observation. It was created through kind of a time-honored stained glass technique called acid etching. So they would have glass. Are you familiar with the concept of flashed glass? It's one color of glass with a thin overlay of another color of glass over it, kind of a whisper of color over this sheet of glass. And they would use hydrofluoric acid to etch away one color to reveal the color below. So in this instance, I suspect that it's probably a yellow glass with a thin layer of blue over it, and it was acid etched to create that little snaking element that you're commenting on.
All the artwork upstairs, is that all leaded? Is there any, like, where they do the foil work or anything?
Yes, a lot of it is copper foiled. So Tiffany's leaded glass, we refer to it broadly as leaded glass, but that doesn't necessarily mean that lead came was used for all of it. So typically in the windows, very early in Tiffany's production, they were just using lead came, which is sort of looks like an H. And so you would turn the H on its side and you would slide pieces of glass into each of these open channels, and you would kind of bend the pieces of lead came around each piece of glass and solder them in place to build the window. Tiffany adopted this technique called copper foil, where they would take a very thin sheet of copper foil, cut it into very thin strips, and take very small pieces of glass and wrap the outside edge of the glass in copper foil. That metal, that copper, is what the solder would stick to, and it kind of acted as the glue to assemble these things. It was a wonderful technique for works of art that had very tiny pieces of glass. If you were to take a piece of glass this big and wrap it in that H-shaped lead came, it would essentially swallow that piece of glass. And so by using this very thin strips of copper foil and wrapping the exterior, you would still be able to see every wonderful curve and see the majority of the piece of glass. So copper foil was used, all of the lamps are copper foil. There's no lead came in them. That's why you can get those really tiny pieces and those really delicate little lines. So it's an important piece of the Tiffany puzzle when you're talking about leaded glass. Yeah.
All these different types of glasses that Tiffany produced, and he had a whole business of people that were making it.
Yeah.
Is that gone now?
It's gone.
It is totally gone?
Yes. So the Tiffany furnaces, we don't actually know the exact date when they closed. It seems to have been around 1930 or so. There are still people making opalescent glass today, and there's some beautiful material that's being made. And in fact, some of these glass houses work closely with private collectors and museums to help recreate some of this glass that you just can't get your hands on anymore and you might need for restoration. But it's interesting because we've bought a lot of new opalescent glass over the years to make educational models and things to show how these things are made. And the glass is gorgeous, but it feels really different than Tiffany's glass. And the colors, while they're beautiful, they're just different from what Tiffany was doing. There's kind of this softness and subtlety to it. And no one is really reproducing anything that I've seen that approximates it. Beautiful, but just different. Well, if you have any more questions here, I see one all the way in the back. Did you raise your hand?
In the pieces of work that have facial features, are
Yes.
those painted?
They are painted, yes, thank you. This is a very important point. So we've been talking about painting in color and light, but there were certain elements in the windows that just couldn't be successfully replicated in glass, facial features being chief among them. And so early on, Tiffany did try to abolish all painting from his windows. So some of the very earliest windows that I've seen have kind of strange metal overlays to create the features, or wire that's soldered to the edges and then kind of bent over the faces. You've probably seen these in dentist's office where it's like the glasses, or like these little wires. Not so successful. I mean, interesting, but not so visually appealing. And so in pretty short order, they began to use painting sparingly to create some of these facial features.
Like in the work, The Reader.
Yes, exactly.
But I noticed that there was no notation of any of the artists who
No
did the
notation of
painting.
any of...
Yeah.
Well, we don't know the names of the people who were doing the paintings. In some instances, the designers of the windows like this fellow Frederick Wilson that I mentioned, he likely was painting a number of the faces in his windows, but he was cranking out so many designs and so many people were helping to produce windows that he had designed that it's unlikely that he would have been able to paint every single face. He was very busy designing and running this department. And in fact, after Frederick Wilson leaves the Tiffany studios in the 20s, a number of his designs are still in production, and you can see that the faces still resemble sort of this pre-Raphaelite look that he was famous for, but something is just a little off. And so we posit that that there are probably people painting in Frederick Wilson's style and trying to replicate some of those facial features. So it's a complicated history to unravel, and we do try to give credit to all of these people when they're known, but we don't know, for instance, who was designing the lamp bases. It's a big gap in Tiffany's scholarship, and we've recently come across articles that mention some of the women who were doing some of the painting in these windows, but we're just in the very early stages of researching their life and their contributions, and I suspect that we won't get very far, but we do try to give credit where credit is due and putting names to faces in these parts of Tiffany's production. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Lindsay,
Thank
and
you.
thank you everyone for coming out this evening.